Hey everyone, it's Father Charles here, and welcome to another episode of Catholic Themes in Tolkien. Today we're going to talk about tradition. And just right off the bat, I want to go into the text because I think there's a particular scene from the text which I think puts into context everything that we're going to say in the segment that follows. So it's the scene from Two Towers. It's in the Road to Isengard chapter. And it's where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are traveling with King Theoden and his men. They're en route to their parley with Saruman. It says, suddenly 3 strange shapes come forward out of the trees. As the alarmed riders of Rohan begin reaching for their sword, Gandalf bids them to stand down. He says, these are but herdsmen, they are not enemies. Theoden is bewildered, and he asks, what are they, Gandalf? For it is plain that to you, at any rate, they are not strange. Gandalf responds, they are shepherds of the trees. Is it so long since you listened to tales by the fireside? There are children in your land who, out of the twisted threads of story, could pick the answer to your question. You have seen Ents, O king. Ents out of Fangorn Forest, which in your tongue you call the Entwood. Did you think that the name was given only in idle fancy? Nay, Theoden, it is otherwise. To them you are but the passing tale. All the years from Eorl the young to Theoden the old are of little count to them, and all the deeds of your house are but a small matter. So Gandalf offers Theoden the answer to his question along with some needed historical perspective, which all too often seems to be lacking in Middle-earth, especially amongst the leaders who should know better. Gandalf's broader experience, wider vision, and not least his command of Middle-earth lore allows him to give an authoritative reply to Theoden's queries. Theoden's humility allows him to accept the correction, and he begins to see his error. After a time of thoughtful silence, this is how Theoden responds. Ents. Out of the shadows of legend I begin to understand. Long have we tended our beasts and our fields, built our houses, wrought our tools. We cared little for what lay beyond the borders of our land. Songs we have that tell of these things, but we are forgetting them, teaching them only to children as a careless custom. And now the songs have come down among us out of strange places and walk visible under the sun. So here we see a recurring theme in The Lord of the Rings. With some rare exceptions, the various realms of Middle-earth are peopled and even led by beings who see and care little about the world beyond their borders and beyond their history, that which pertains to their immediate needs. And this is a flaw which Sauron exploits fully to his advantage. Until recently, Theoden would not even see what was happening outside of his own hall, let alone what's happening in the wider world of Middle-earth. Dwarves, hobbits, Ents, men of Rohan and Gondor all are concerned chiefly with their own people and borders, and usually require intervention to rouse them from the little life that they know into the larger destiny of Middle-earth itself. Even the elves, whose immortality gives them the advantage of long historical memory, tend to settle into an aloof state of low-grade indifference that sometimes borders on despair. So Theoden is not a dumb man, he's not a dull man. When given the chance to see the evidence, he readily regrets his isolationism, and he begins to see what is at stake. And he says, yet also I should be sad. For however the fortune of war shall go, may it not so end that much that was fair and wonderful shall pass forever out of Middle-earth. The prospective loss of something beautiful evokes sadness and regret in Theoden. Wonder and surprise are in danger of passing from reality, and in this way, tradition is vindicated. So basically, Gandalf's like, remember the old wives' tales? Well, old wives told tales for a reason. There was something behind those tales, and even the children of your realm would know this. And so Theoden, he gets it. He begins to realize what's at stake here. It's not just Rohan. It's the entirety of Middle-earth, including these beautiful, wondrous creatures called Ents. And he realizes, gee, whatever happens in this war, it seems like much that is fair and beautiful is going to pass forever out of Middle-earth. And he begins to feel regret and sadness. Now, suddenly, his heart is moved not just by what directly pertains to his own borders, but he's beginning to see the bigger picture and lament the loss that could take place. So, tradition was far from vindicated in Tolkien's day. In Tolkien's time, as a man of the 20th century, there was historical myopia, post-war skepticism, and no small amount of preconception dominated by the cultural and academic environment of Tolkien's time. A certain modernist chronological snobbery prevailed, as Tolkien's friend, fellow Inkling, fellow fantasist, and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis once observed. Tolkien studied and taught ancient languages, myths, and sagas, and this was an outmoded canon, frankly, that few of Tolkien's companions and colleagues regarded, given their pre-industrial, pre-scientific, pre-modern contexts and origins. So the scene with Theoden discovering the Ents, I think, points to some of the concerns in Tolkien's own life and in his profession. In a certain sense, Tolkien was a Gandalf figure. Not for any wizardry he possessed, other than perhaps literary skill, and not because of otherworldly power and courage. Tolkien likened himself to a hobbit. Rather, like Gandalf, Tolkien possessed an unusually vast store of ancient lore and wisdom. But these went mostly unknown and unappreciated, kind of like they did with Gandalf. Tolkien's challenge was sharing this valuable and helpful store of lore that he had learned in a compelling and relevant way to the people of his time. So Tolkien was an Oxford philology professor. I don't even think we have philology anymore. Now I guess it would be called linguistics. So philology, the etymology of the word means philo, love, and logos, the word. So literally a love of the word, a love of language. And he specialized in Old and Middle English. And this was a field viewed by his colleagues and contemporaries as kind of irrelevant during a time in which the critical study of modern literature was the fashionable trend in academia. Tom Shippey has a whole chapter in The Road to Middle Earth called Lit and Lang, short for literature and language, and kind of the dichotomy, dialectic that existed in the academy in Tolkien's day. Tolkien was competing with teachers of English literature for time, funds, and students. Shippey calls this a thankless task since the current was setting firmly away from him and his subjects. Tolkien once complained that philology is in some quarters treated as though it were one of the things the late war, World War I, was fought to end. Tolkien was an outsider, isolated in the academic community, feeling like a lone exponent of language, with new generations of scholars failing to understand its importance. So, in many ways, Tolkien was a Gandalf figure, except nobody was interested in Gandalf anymore. Who cares about this ancient store of lore and language? Who cares about these ancient medieval myths and sagas? These are not relevant to contemporary concerns. Get with the times, old man. That was kind of by and large, was the contemporary attitude. So for his part, aside from the sheer philologist's delight that Tolkien took in language itself, he saw the important virtues and attitudes on display in these old stories and values that had in recent times, in Tolkien's opinion, become scarce. Tolkien, like Gandalf, had a firm grasp of traditions wherein the answers to vexing questions facing the modern world could be found. So a notable example expressed in the Old English poem The Battle of Maldon is the theory of courage, once called by Tolkien the great contribution to humanity of the old literature of the North. Such courage embodies the clearest statement of the doctrine of uttermost endurance in the service of indomitable will, the sheer refusal of despair in the face of hopeless odds. Shippey writes that Tolkien's attachment to the theory of courage made him believe that the Western world in his lifetime had been short not of wit or of strength, but of will. So think about Theoden at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and his great speech. You know, they knew that this was going to be a very dire battle and that many of them were going to die. In fact, in the movie, they all shout death. But they go forward anyway because it's the right thing to do. And they're going to defy the odds. They're going to stick it to the man in the face of impossible odds, even if they die trying, because they're not going to go out like chumps. That's me phrasing it in very colloquial language. Tolkien himself obviously used much higher and grander and more beautiful words to describe it, but I think this is pretty much the effect of the Northern theory of courage that Tolkien wanted to see on display, because he said, today's world, it's in short supply. And so let's put it in this tale in a way that's attractive and relevant. to modern people. Shippey notes that the theory of courage is demonstrated often by the wise characters in Lord of the Rings who are often without hope and so near the edge of despair, but they do not succumb. The Ride of the Rohirrim, again, we've mentioned, is an excellent example of the theory of courage. So, like Gandalf, Tolkien's challenge was to find ways to get others to heed the ancient wisdom that he had access to and that he was willing to share. Tolkien took up the challenge by writing. Shippey writes of Tolkien, he knew his own country was falling back to heathenism again, if only in the model of Saruman, not Sauron. And while mere professorial preaching might make no difference, story might. One of Tolkien's greatest gifts was his ability to reconstruct the great insights of ancient lore and myth while representing them in a story ancient in style but modern in substance. Tolkien drew special inspiration from the 19th century Finnish doctor and philologist Elias Lönnrot, I hope I'm saying that right, whose painstaking work of collecting Finnish and Karelian folklore and poetry culminated in the publication of the Kalevala, Finland's national epic. It was one of Tolkien's favorite works. He had a particular love for the Finnish language and modeled his Elvish language Quenya, one of two that he created after it. And he modeled Sindarin, the other Elvish language, after Welsh. Lönnrot's preservation of Finland's oral traditions through the written reconstruction of the Kalevala in many ways epitomized and modeled what Tolkien sought to do in his Middle-earth stories. The Kalevala played an instrumental role in the development of the Finnish national identity, the intensification of Finland's language strife, and the growing sense of nationality that ultimately led to Finland's independence from Russia in 1917. That's from Wikipedia, so you know it's true. Incidentally, there's this really cool DVD. I'm not sure if you can get it on streaming services, but National Geographic put it out, and it coincided with the first movie, Fellowship of the Ring, being released. And it's this really cool look into some of the background of Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien's background, and kind of how that was tapped into for the movie. And there's this amazing interview that they do with this guy called Jussi. He lives in Finland. He's probably dead now. This was filmed 20 years ago. And Jussi knew the entire Kalevala according to all the rhythms and meters and melodies, so that the oral tradition it had. Its course is written down now. But the Finns had preserved this for a long time, passed it from generation down to generation orally in terms of, like, again, the meter and the song of it. And this guy Jussi was the last guy to know it. He was trying to teach some other people so that they might be able to pass it on. But there's this one poignant part of the interview where the guy says, when Jussi dies, it's going to basically be like 1,000 years of tradition dies with him. Because there was not an organism or an apparatus in place to really pass it on. Younger generations really were not that interested. He lived in kind of a dying fishing village. And, it's kind of like the guy said, it's the equivalent of like an ancient library, burning. Because all this store of lore and language is being forgotten. And so this is kind of a prevalent theme that you see throughout Tolkien. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Tolkien was fascinated with Finnish, the Kalevala, and Lönnrot's role in its reconstruction, as well as the role this literature played in helping Finland regain its voice and freedom from centuries of political oppression. This fascination helped move him to try and do the same for his own country. Tolkien once said, "I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands." He mentioned the Greek, Celtic, Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, and Finnish traditions, which he knew so well, but he lamented that there was nothing save impoverished chapbook stuff in his own tradition. In another letter written a few years later, he described the task to which he set himself, to restore to the English an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own. His success proved so great that the London paper The Guardian would say at his centennial in 1992, how, given a little over a half century of work, did one man become the creative equivalent of a people? Well said, Guardian. In an essay entitled English, Welsh, and Elvish, Deirdre Dawson quotes Tolkien's well-known statement to his editor that while writing The Lord of the Rings, he always had the sense of recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. She goes on to compare Tolkien's project with that of James Macpherson, the 18th century Scotsman, widely recognized as a translator of the Ossian cycle of poems. And Dawson says, Tolkien's own project, therefore, was not unlike the project of the Hobbits, as described by the narrator of the prologue. He wished to reconstruct in writing a history that was already there, somewhere. Whether they were working from texts that already existed or reconstructing a history that might have existed somewhere, the literary genius of Macpherson and Tolkien lay in their ability to create myths for their own time in a style that was accessible to their contemporary audiences without losing a sense of historical and linguistic authenticity. Dawson notes the pervasive sense of loss in Lord of the Rings, which for Tolkien was not linked to one defining moment, but was rather an accumulated sense of loss of which he had always been aware. This sense of loss presents the reader with a world which is slipping away before the characters and the reader's eyes and which will never return except in songs and stories. It's kind of the source of some of the melancholy that we feel when we read The Lord of the Rings. Dawson cites numerous examples from the text. There's Aragorn's recitation at Weathertop of the tale of Tinuviel, of which he says to Frodo, "It is a long tale of which the end is not known. It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your heart." There is Treebeard's lament of the loss of the woods and of the Entwives. Gimli's regret over what has become of Moria and the realm of Durin. Legolas' lament over the loss of Nimrodel and her lover Amroth. To these could be added the end of the Farewell to Lorien chapter, a departure which left none of the fellowship unmoved, including Gimli and Legolas, who says, "Alas for us all, and for all that walk in the world in these after days. For such is the way of it, to find and to lose, as it seems to those whose boat is on the running stream." And then, of course, there is Gandalf's reply to Theoden's lament, which we began this chapter with. Presented in the beginning, "It may," he says, "the evil of Sauron cannot be wholly cured, nor made as if it had not been. But to such days we are doomed." This is an answer to Theoden's statement that might it be that much that is precious and beautiful may pass forever out of Middle-earth when this whole war is over. So Tolkien once wrote to his son Christopher of an emotion that moved him supremely, and which I find small difficulty in evoking. The heart-racking sense of the vanished past, best expressed by Gandalf's words about the Palantir. In the passage in question, Gandalf explains to Pippin what the Palantiri were, how they were made and used by the Númenóreans to see and communicate far-off things with one another over distances of both space and time. This is when they're leaving the realm of Rohan to go to Gondor, because soon Sauron's going to be sending messengers to get what he thinks is the ring from Pippin, after Pippin has looked into the Palantir. Gandalf says, "Who knows where the lost stones of Arnor and Gondor now lie, buried or drowned deep." You might remember there were 7 of the Palantir, and Gandalf is saying, most of them have been lost. We don't really know what became of them. Ah, for the old days when we could see things that were far off through these wonderful stones. He says, "Even now my heart desires to test my will upon it, to see if I could not wrench it from Sauron and turn it where I would. To look across the wide seas of water and of time to Tirion the Fair, and perceive the unimaginable hand and mind of Feanor at their work, while both the white tree and the golden were in flower." He sighed and fell silent. So to take another step in appreciating the subtle and profound understanding Tolkien had of tradition and its importance, we can turn to the work of Tolkien scholar Verlin Flieger. I've said before that if Tom Shippey is sort of the Gandalf of Tolkien scholarship, I think Verlin Flieger is kind of the Galadriel. Amazing stuff. I've learned a ton from her stuff. And in her work, Splintered Light, Logos and Language in Tolkien's World, it's a hard read, be forewarned, but one that is worth the effort. Profound stuff. She carefully demonstrates the ways in which Tolkien repeatedly employed fellow Inkling Owen Barfield's linguistic theory of the fragmentation of meaning. Owen Barfield is one of the members of the Inklings that we don't really hear too much about. Most people are aware of C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, I think C.S. Lewis's brother. But poor Owen Barfield, he was kind of one of the more obscure and overlooked members of the Inklings, and yet he wrote this work that it was of profound influence to Tolkien, especially in the realm of tradition. So this is kind of abstract and dense stuff. I'm going to try to clarify it in a way that's as understandable as possible. It's really not that complicated, but just some of the language can be a little difficult. Anyway, Barfield suggests that humanity's understanding and use of language and meaning have proceeded from unity to multiplicity, from the one to the many, over the long course of time. Here's a quote. Humankind in its beginnings had a sense of the cosmos as a whole and of itself as a part of that whole, a sense that has long since been left behind. We now perceive the cosmos as particularized, fragmented, and entirely separate from ourselves. Our consciousness and the language with which we express that consciousness have changed and splintered. So it's the idea that we went from word to words. And as time progresses, we move more and more into this fragmentation. And the original unity of both language and reality itself become more and more difficult for us to apprehend and ascertain. Flieger speaks of Barfield's concept of ancient semantic unity, explaining that word, percept, and concept have altered so that the former wholeness has of necessity been fragmented. She says fragmentation of perception has led over time to a fragmentation of language. It's kind of like the Tower of Babel incident, where the world went from one language to many because of humanity's pride, going back to the book of Genesis. Tolkien's acceptance of Barfield's theory involved a whole new way of looking at words, seeing them not just as parts of language, but as fragments of the logos, integral elements in the way we relate to our surroundings. The special task of the poet is to bridge that separation, to use words to reconnect what they had severed. Words were to be the poetic instruments of humankind's ultimate and conscious reunion with God. So philologists were kind of like the Indiana Jones of the language world, the archaeology. Archaeologists try to seek these little fragments and then try to piece together the history, of which they are now a long forgotten part. Well, that's what philologists do with language. They try to take the fragments and the shards of ancient languages to piece together the cultures which once gave rise to them and to learn from them so that we can benefit today from the wisdom of past ages. So it might all sound kind of abstract or rarefied, but for Flieger, it involves a hermeneutic key to understanding Tolkien's entire mythology. And having read her stuff and really wrestled with it, and of course knowing Tolkien, I would have to say, I agree. I find her argument very sound and actually very insightful as a way of unlocking deeper elements of Tolkien's genius. So through her insightful analysis, we're helped to understand the importance of tradition for Tolkien and how he illustrated this importance in his work. Using Barfield's theory of ancient semantic unity, Flieger applies it to Tolkien's use of light metaphors, hence the title of her book, Splintered Light. Beginning with the Silmarillion, she shows how the primal light that illumined all of reality, all of the visible earth, if you will, began with the two mighty lamps wrought by the Valar Aule, which the satanic Valor, the rebel figure, the Lucifer-type guy, Melkor threw down and destroyed. This is all in the Silmarillion, if you want to go deep into Tolkien's lore and sort of the foundations upon which the story of the Lord of the Rings builds. So after these lights were thrown down, then came the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion. And this is really beautiful. It says that they were planted and they were watered by the tears of what was her name? Nienna, the Weeper. And says that Olorin, who was Gandalf in his former days before he came to Middle-earth, would often consult with Nienna. And so Nienna and, I can't remember who it was, the female Valar, I'll put it up on screen. Anyway, they collaborated in this singular work of art to create these two trees, the light of which became the light of the sun and the moon. Well, actually, Melkor destroyed these trees, and then what was left of them, we have the light of the sun and the moon. So that tells you how bright they were before they were destroyed. So you always see this light being created by the good guys, being destroyed by the bad guys, and then coming back, but in a diminished form. So it's like, going from light to lights is kind of the analogy that pertains to going from word to words. So then later the mighty elf Feanor captures some of the light of the two trees in his Silmarils, hence the word Silmarillion. He made these three precious jewels containing this light, which eventually are lost after much bitterness. It's a huge drama in the Silmarillion. Way too much to go into right now. But by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, all that remains of this ancient primal light is the Phial of Galadriel, which is given as a special gift to Frodo as a light for dark places. For Flieger, the shift from light to lights mirrors the linguistic shift from word to words, as we said. And in each case, Color and variety are brought into the world, though with ever greater fragmentation and departure from the primal unity of light/word. The hobbits, and Frodo in particular, become the embodiment of this recovery and reconstruction through the fragments. She says, if Tolkien's version of the fall is a story of humanity's separation from the light, and if that separation continues and proliferates through fragmentation of light, language, and peoples, then the final working out of the principle will be within the smallest fragments and appropriately within the smallest people. Flieger documents this process in Frodo, already in the Fellowship of the Ring during his recovery at Rivendell after his near-tragic wound at the hands of the Witch King. Gandalf notes a change in Frodo. Just a hint, as it were, of transparency. Still, that must be expected, said Gandalf to himself. He is not half through yet, and to what he will come in the end, not even Elrond can foretell. Not to evil, I think. He may become like a glass filled with a clear light for eyes to see that can. This foreshadows a process which reaches a culminating point in Shelob's lair, where Frodo gathers his courage and at last uses the file against Shelob, whose eyes were never before afflicted by so deadly a brightness. Throughout the story, as Frodo's resolve weakens and he fades increasingly into the other world of the ring, he becomes the microcosm, the smallest particle wherein the whole drama of splintering and diminution will be reenacted. As such, he implies the whole as a grain of sand implies the desert or a mote of dust the round earth. For a brief moment at least, Frodo facing down Shelob becomes the file, a glass filled with clear light, emptied of self so as to become a transparent vessel for the primal light to shine forth in Middle-earth at its darkest. So basically what Flieger is saying here is that, as light gives way to lights, as word gives way to words, the primal oneness gives way to sort of the fragments. Gandalf's job is to kind of collect these fragments and try to bring them into a coherent, unified whole, because Sauron exploits the whole divide and conquer strategy to his full advantage. And so Frodo represents, Flieger is saying, kind of like the tiniest fragment. But the tiniest fragment ends up becoming the vessel for the ancient primal light. So just as the Phial of Galadriel is the last remaining artifact on Middle-earth that still contains some of the primal light, it makes sense that Frodo, now emptied of self through his quest, becomes the bearer of this light. And when the darkness is at its greatest, Frodo is now transparent enough that this light can shine through him. This is really deep stuff. It may take you a couple viewings or readings if you're reading the book to be able to really grasp this. But once you do it, it really starts to make sense. And we're going to explain it a little further here. I think this is brilliant stuff, and I think it gets even more brilliant. So at the stairs of Cirith Ungol, it was the file which prompted Sam to gain heart and perspective. We talked about this in the Samwise Gamgee segment. And why, sir, I've never thought of that before. Well, you've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, come to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's still going on. The file contains history and tradition, sort of concentrated in this one small but dense artifact. The file contains history and tradition, providing Sam with awareness as a center for the elements of the story to be contained and evoked. It puts darkness at bay while providing meaning, perspective, and hope during a dire time. The gathering of the many back into the one, the collecting of the fragments towards the reconstruction and recovery of the lost unity. For Flieger and Barfield, this gathering and collecting represent the poet's chief task. Tolkien accepted the challenge. So notice, we're very far here from simply the author as a storyteller or an entertainer. We're getting into something far more profound here and beginning to see Tolkien's maybe self-understanding of his vocation as being more than simply a teller of great stories. Tolkien was trying to collect the shattered fragments of the original light, the original words that once were part of the Word, and to once again collect them like the Phial of Galadriel into a dense artifact that was capable of giving light, courage, and hope in dark times. We've already discussed Tolkien as a Gandalf figure, a lore master with the wisdom needed to unite the aloof and isolated free peoples. Might we also see him in some way as the poetic equivalent of a Frodo figure, and the Lord of the Rings itself as a Phial? As an orphan, war veteran, close observer of the 20th century's dark tribulations, and marginalized academic, Tolkien was emptied of self and made small. And yet, as a result of what he had been given, he was able to hold amidst the darkness of his age a densely concentrated artifact containing the fragments of light so painstakingly gathered up from a vanishing past, kind of like Frodo did in Shelob's lair with the Phial of Galadriel. In Tolkien's phial, so to speak, are the collected remnants of words and lights that shine forth even yet, some reflection of the One, the primal form. For the Catholic faith, which Tolkien professed and practiced devoutly, the primal form of light, truth, beauty, etc., is literally, according to the Bible, the Word, the Logos, which became flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. Christ, the Messiah, God's only begotten Son, the Anointed One, is the source of light. We especially see this in the Gospel of John. Jesus appointed 12 apostles to be the foundation stones for his church. After dying, rising, and ascending to his Father in heaven, Jesus sent his Spirit upon the apostles at Pentecost with the power to go forth and spread the gospel, the good news, to all the world. In their time, their authoritative teachings became codified in written scriptures, now known as the New Testament, a collection of books approved and acknowledged by other recognized authorities in their line. Soon after, a creed was codified, summarizing the unchanging core beliefs. The safeguarding of this deposit of faith is preserved through what Catholics call tradition. You know, when we think about it, how does this Catholic Church endure 2,000 years with its core mission still intact? I mean, think about the eroding effects of time. Think about the fragmenting effects, of beliefs, institutions, organizations. Think about how hard it is for a company just to maintain its core values and its core mission 50 years into its life cycle. And now think about the Catholic Church, which is this global entity that's still around and more or less looks the way it did 2,000 years ago. Well, this is where tradition comes in. This is what Pope Benedict XVI once said about tradition. There is an unbroken chain in the life of the Church, in the proclamation of the Word of God, of the celebration of the sacraments, that has come down to us and that we call tradition. It gives us the guarantee that what we believe is the original message of Christ, preached by the apostles. In this way, if sacred scripture contains the Word of God, the tradition of the Church preserves it and faithfully transmits it, so that men and women of every age might have access to its vast resources and be enriched by its treasures of grace. For the Church, then, tradition thus preserves the deposit of faith and its core truths and values and forms a valuable safeguard against the fragmenting and splintering effects of time. One might say that tradition is in some sense the vessel which contains the primal light of the original Word, or Logos, of God, preserving it from the fragmenting dissolution of time and trends. While the objective truths of the one Word stay the same, however, the subjective tendencies of people, even those with faith, change with time. The Word becomes translated into words, with risk of being weakened, diluted, or faded into irrelevance and oblivion as new generations become more and more unfamiliar with the original spirit and meaning. What was once familiar becomes foreign. The challenge becomes how to transmit ancient faith truths amidst an increasingly changing, fragmenting, and skeptical world, and the problem is particularly vexing, one for which effective answers are not easily or often presented. Tolkien responded to the challenge of the increasing fragmentation of light, words, and consciousness by writing. The dilemma faced by Tolkien the scholar and answered by Tolkien the fantasist was similar to that faced and answered by Tolkien the Catholic. Like the ancient legends and myth lore of Tolkien's beloved classic languages and traditions, the Catholic faith as well offers a vast store of wisdom that is not always easily communicated or readily accepted, especially in a modern world moving ever more rapidly away in both distance and interest from the vanishing past. Like the medieval languages and their sagas, the Church is often dismissed as irrelevant by contemporaries, ready to write it off as a relic of an outdated past, perhaps even as an obstacle to future progress. And with the cause of the sagas, so with the Church. Skill and creativity are needed for representing their ancient truths in compelling and relevant ways that connect with people of today. To go back to the light analogies, the fragmenting process leading from lamps to trees, to leaves, to silmarils, to the phial, pose just as significant a challenge for the faith. From Jesus of Nazareth to the ordinary Christian believer today, a great gulf of time and history exists. Making things more difficult for the Church are the scandals, hypocrisy, historical baggage, and just the general mass of sin, which causes the Church to often conceal rather than reveal the the mystery of God in the world. This topic is discussed at greater length in the sacramentality segment, particularly episode 1 of that. The point is that Tolkien labored to propose traditional wisdom in an era far from conducive to its welcome and ready acceptance, not only with regard to myth lore, but also to deep truths of his Catholic faith tradition. The challenge Tolkien faced as a Catholic is summed up well by Catholic novelist and National Book Award winner Walker Percy, who said, "The words of religion tend to wear out and get stored in the attic. So decrepit and abused is the language of the Judeo-Christian religions that it takes an effort to salvage them, the very words, from the husks and barnacles of meaning which have encrusted them over the centuries. Or else words can become slick as coins worn thin by usage and so devalued. One of the tasks of the saint is to renew language, to sing a new song." Tolkien may or may not have been a saint, but he certainly knew his language. Employing it with love and wisdom, Tolkien did his part to sing a new song, as Percy said. The themes discussed in this book are evidence of how artfully Tolkien succeeded in presenting traditional Catholic truths, steeping them into the story, letting them become absorbed into the story, if you will. Great Catholic themes such as the intruder, grace, the unlooked-for friend, providence, resurrection, mercy, stewardship, sacramentality, fellowship, tradition. These are like Ents, allies that we have forgotten or neglected for manifold reasons. Maybe we've even come to disregard them, kind of like Theoden had done. Although some might teach them carelessly to children, few know any more of their reality and power. Amid the growing endangerment of the life in Middle-earth, even Middle-earth itself, Gandalf faced an ignorance of history and a neglect of traditions amongst the people who's trying to rally to the cause. He faced the alienation and isolation of the free peoples who had forgotten their lore. As Galadriel narrates in the beginning of the first Peter Jackson film, much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. Some things that should have not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend, legend became myth. So one of Gandalf's tasks was to remember and to make others remember, and thankfully for Middle-earth and for us, Gandalf did. So as a philologist, Tolkien faced bias and prejudice against his beloved field of study and its related histories and literatures. And as a Catholic, he faced hostility and misunderstandings from without, decadence and forgetfulness from within. He did not give up, he did not give in. Instead, he wrote, so that he was able to show us some splinter of the primal word, the primal light in which we begin to recognize something greater. So perhaps the reader is like Theoden, awakened, summoned from the dark hall, invited to breathe the free air. Gandalf's call has led us out of despair, to become a link in the great chain, to recognize that this great chain exists, and to encourage us to become a part of it, to become a splinter of the great light and a protagonist in the great story. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.